Hi everyone, welcome to session 206, talking about 3D Touch. My name is Ryan Nystrom, and I'm an engineer at Instagram. At Instagram, we were lucky enough to work with Apple and add 3D Touch to our app for the first day of the iPhone 6s launch. It was incredibly exciting, and hopefully we can teach you a little bit of just about how 3D Touch works. In this first section, we're going to be covering quick actions. So quick actions, commonly referred to as shortcuts. Quick actions are shortcuts to common actions within your application. Things that your users would do pretty frequently, and you can help them get to really quickly. They should be reserved for things that are really cumbersome to get to, other parts of your app that take a couple swipes, or maybe you have to tap a couple buttons or change tabs. These are really good candidates for quick actions. Let's take a look at what a quick action looks like. We can see that after we 3D touch on the RWDevCon app there, the actions pop up almost like a right click, and we can select the action and jump straight to it in the app. Before we get coding, let's cover the two different types of actions that exist for 3D Touch. First one is called a static action. These static actions are defined in your info plist file and become available as soon as your application is installed. You can have up to four actions in your info plist. Like I said, they're installed immediately with your application because they're already in the info plist file. The other action is a dynamic action. These actions you can add and change at runtime, meaning that you can modify their content, the title, the subtitle. One thing to keep in mind though is that static actions always get priority. So you can only have four actions at a time, and if you use all of your four actions for static actions, you won't ever be able to add a dynamic one. And one other downside is that you have to run your app at least once for your actions to be installed. On Instagram, we ran into this trouble considering the logged in and logged out state for our actions. If we were to stick with a static action for the login button, that action would always be present even if the user has already logged in. So in that case, we ended up going with all dynamic actions. Let's take a look at the actual API for adding a shortcut to your app. The main class that we'll be working with is UI application shortcut item. This item has a title, an optional subtitle, an icon, and a type. This type is just a string that lets your app identify what sort of action was actually taken from the home screen when your app launches. Enough explanation, let's get down to code. Alright, for this first demo, let's make sure that we're looking in the Demo 1 folder, the starter project, and we should have a folder in there called Vendor Chat, and let's open up the Vendor Chat Xcode project. In this project, before we get started, let's go ahead and build and run and take a look at the sample app. Now you'll need to have an iPhone with 3D Touch or a modern MacBook Pro that has one of the 3D Touch trackpads. So looking at the actual app here, it's just a messaging app. You can see that we have message threads here, and I can jump into my thread with Ray, send him a message. Hey Ray. I've got a new message button up in the top right. And I also have tabs so that I can see a list of all the contacts here at the conference, and then I can view my own profile. But wouldn't it be nice if we had quick shortcuts to be able to jump right into message threads or jump to one of our tabs instead of having to open the app and then navigate? Well, that's exactly what 3D Touch can let us do. So in the project, let's find our info plist file. You can also just select the Xcode project in the navigator and click info at the top. Click anywhere in the custom iOS target properties and click add row. We're going to give this row the key UI application shortcut items. And let's change the type to an array. Next, let's expand the array and click the plus sign so we get a new item. And let's change this item 0 type to a dictionary. Expand to item 0, click the plus sign again, and let's give this new item the key UI application shortcut item title with the value contacts with a capital C. Let's add another item with the key UI application shortcut item type. This time values contacts, all lowercase this time. And one more time for UI application shortcut item icon file. And you guessed it, contacts. All right, let's add another entry, but instead of typing it all out, let's just select item 0, copy, and just did Command C there, and then Command V. Oops, let's go to the top level, Command V, and we should have 2 items. Looks good. Now on the second item, so this is item 1, let's just change the value of the title to new space message, the value of the type to lowercase new dash message, and the icon file, sorry to be inconsistent here, pencil. Awesome. Let's go ahead and build and run our application. Now instead of doing anything in the app, let's immediately hit the home screen, go back to our app icon, 3D Touch, and there we have sorry if we can edit this part out, and I'm going to reinstall this. All right, cut right here. If we build and run, then we 3D touch on the app, and we can see we've added our first static action. Now, if I were to select one of these, it doesn't actually go anywhere. But luckily, that's super easy to add. So let's find our app delegate file. And in this file, sorry, let's edit this out too, my bad. Okay. In this file, let's add a new method, override application perform action for shortcut item. And there's a completion handler there too. Inside this function, let's first grab the tab bar of the app. So let tab bar controller equal window optional root view controller as UI tab bar controller. We're all optionally casting all of this here. Now for our 2 shortcut items, so we've got new message and contacts. For the first one, let's just handle what happens when you tap on contacts. Let's add a switch statement and switch on the shortcut item type. For our first case, we'll just handle the string contacts. Now, Swift makes handling strings super easy, so we can still use switch statements here. So for contacts, let's first set on our tab bar controller, set the selected index to 1. And to make sure that we are actually at the root of that navigation controller on that tab, let's get the navigation controller. So let navigation controller equal tab bar controller selected view controller, because we've already selected the controller at index 1. Now let's just take that navigation controller and call pop to root. Oops. Oh, we missed our cast. As UI navigation controller, again all optional. And then let's call navigation controller pop to root view controller, and we're going to do animated as false, because this is going to be called right when the app is opening, and we don't want to do any animations here because we've already got the animation going from the icon into the app. So let's build and run again. Oops. Add our default break here. There we go. Build and run. Again, go back to the home screen. Select the contacts option, and we jump into the app right to contacts. All right, but what about the new message? Well, let's just go back and add another case. So case, remember this is the type that we defined in our info plist. So this is new dash message. And again, let's, on the tab bar controller, set the selected index to 0. And we can get the navigation controller. So let navigation controller, same way as above, equal tab bar controller dot selected view controller as UI navigation controller. And let's see, on this first navigation controller, select the view controllers, and we're just going to grab the first one there because and on the first one, let's call perform segue with identifier. We use the string new message with camel case there, or sorry, capitalize. And sender, we can just pass in self. Not really going to use it, but good practice to have. All right, build and run again. Go back to our home screen, select the icon, select new message, and it takes us straight into the new message interface. Awesome. Now what else can we add? Wouldn't it be nice when I'm looking at this message thread? This one at the top, my message from Ray, is the newest one that I've got. What if instead of having to open the app and navigate into that message thread, I could jump straight to it from the home screen? Well, that's where dynamic actions come in. So in our app delegate, let's find the application did finish launching with options method. And before we return, let's do let threads equal load threads. It's a helper method that's going to load all of the active threads that we've got in our app. And let's call if let last message equals threads dot first dot last text message. Inside this if statement, let's call let icon equal UI application shortcut icon, and our template image name, the string chat. Next, let shortcut equal UI application shortcut item. And we're going to go with the long initializer here. So for our type, again, that's our type string that we'll use below in this perform action for shortcut item. Let's use the string latest dash thread. For our localized title, we're just going to use the string view recent. Now, typically you should actually localize these strings, but for our demo's sake, we're just going to use a normal string. Our localized subtitle, let's actually use the last message dot user dot name, so we can put the actual user that we received the message from in the subtitle. Our icon, let's pass in the icon variable that we just set above, and user info is nil. Now you could set a dictionary of extra data in that user info that would then be passed into this perform action for shortcut item method. Finally, to actually set the dynamic action, all we need to do is on application, the actual application passed into this method, set dot shortcut items equals shortcut, just an array of shortcuts. All right, let's build and run the app. All right, back to the home screen. On the app icon, and we can see there view recent, and we can see that it's our most recent message from Ray. Now again, if we tap on it, it doesn't actually do anything. But just like with the static actions, we can fix that. So let's go back in our app delegate to perform action for shortcut item. At the end, let's add another case statement. Case latest dash thread. Remember, that's just the type that we added above. On our tab bar controller, let's set the selected index to 0. Again, get the navigation controller, so let navigation controller equal tab bar controller dot selected view controller as UI navigation controller. Next, we're going to use a helper method to create a new message thread controller. So let's do if let message controller equals window dot root view controller dot storyboard dot new messages view controller. So if we're able to successfully create a new message controller inside the if statement, on the message controller, let's set the thread to thread equals load threads dot first. So we're just going to use the first thread, similar to what we did up here in app did finish launching with options here. Now after we've set the data on that message thread, let's take our navigation controller and call push view controller, passing in our new message controller. And again, for the animated flag, let's just do false so we don't have a bunch of animations flying around the screen. All right, build and run. And back to our home screen. And let's tap on the view recent, and it jumps us straight into our thread with Ray. And that's our demo on quick actions. For the second part of our demo, we're going to dive into an API in 3D Touch called Peek and Pop. Peek and Pop is a card-style interface that lets you take quick looks at your content. You can see an example of it in this video, where the 3D Touch on the photo brings up a peek interface where you can take a look at it. And then if you 3D touch again, you pop into the actual interface. And this is the same sort of interface as if you were to just tap on the image to view it in full screen. So let's do an overview of the actual 3D Touch API. While the 3D Touch marketing API is Peek and Pop, in actual code, instead of Peek and Pop, we'll use the term preview. In the previewing API, there are 3 different parts. For starters, you need a view controller to register what's called a previewing delegate. This previewing delegate is what's responsible for receiving gesture information about when a 3D touch occurs and where. The previewing delegate then decides if a 3D touch is allowed to occur for a peek and pop, and the actual preview view controller that gets displayed. Now this preview view controller is just a normal UI view controller that gets displayed for the peek, except there's no interaction that's allowed. But you still get all of the view lifecycle events like view did load and view will appear. You just can't do anything like gestures or taps. On Instagram, the preview that we display to the user when 3D touching on a user profile looks something like this. On Instagram, we specifically built a UI view controller for Peek, but you could just use your own user profile view controller in the Peek. Another aspect of the Peek and Pop API is the source rect. Now on this demo interface, if we were to 3D touch on that image, we would want to display just that image. With the source rect, that lets you identify the actual rect around that image relative to the screen. This helps tell the system what to blur and what not to blur when actually performing the transition. All right, let's actually jump into the demo. To keep going with demo 2 and dive into Peek and Pop, you can keep using the same sample app that we finished up in the first demo, or if you got lost or want to just go ahead and start here, you can go into demo 2 and find the starter with the WenderChat Xcode project. The first thing that we're going to add for our Peek and Pop is a quick look into the actual message content from our threads. So if we were looking at our app, all of our threads here, it would be great if we could 3D touch on one of these threads and take a look at their actual content. That would let us quickly navigate this entire interface without having to drill into each and every thread. Let's open up our thread view controller.swift and find, or we'll actually override our view did load function. Make sure to call super. And then let's call the method register for previewing with delegate. For our delegate, we're just going to use self, and our source view, we're just using the view controller's view. Now immediately the compiler is going to complain because we're not conforming to the actual protocol that this method requires. So let's go to the bottom of our file, and using Swift extensions, we can conform to this protocol. So let's add an extension of thread view controller. And let's conform to UI view controller previewing delegate. The first method that we need to implement to conform to this protocol is previewing context view controller for location. And the other method is previewing context commit view controller. Now our first method requires us to return something. So let's go ahead and fill this out. So inside the previewing context view controller for location, let's start off by adding a guard. So guard let index path equal table view dot index path for row at point, and let's pass in location. And comma, we'll continue our guard here. Let cell equal table view dot cell for row at index path. And we'll pass in the same index path that we got in our first part. Else return nil. So what this guard will do for us is let us get the index path for the location. Oops, we've got a typo. And then using that index path, if it exists, we'll get the cell at that index path. And if neither of those exists, we just return nil. Next, let's actually set up our source rect. So let frame equal table view dot convert rect cell dot frame to view view. This will actually convert the frame of the cell in our table view to the coordinate space of the view controller's view. This is important so that the source rect actually outlines the cell. Sometimes if you don't actually convert the coordinate spaces, you'll get the right size and bounds of the preview, it just won't be in the right location. To actually set the source rect, we need to use the previewing context parameter and set source rect to frame. Cool. Now lastly, the return type of this function is UI view controller. This is the view controller that's actually going to be responsible for display in the peak. So for this, instead of creating a custom view controller, we can just use the view controller that would be displayed when you're actually looking at a message thread. So for this, let's do let message controller equals storyboard dot new messages view controller. This is just a helper function to create a new view controller from our storyboard. On that message controller, let's set the thread to threads index path dot row. This threads is actually just an array using the load threads method that we used in demo 1. The index path is going to correspond to the same index path that we actually did our 3D touch on. So we can actually take the data from that thread, put it onto our new controller, and to finish it up, let's just return message controller. All right, let's run this and take a look. Now on this message interface, you can go ahead and 3D touch on a thread, and we get an awesome looking preview here. So we're looking at the peak, but now if we want to do a pop, we 3D touch again. Oh, wait a minute. We're looking at the message thread here, but when we try and pop into it, we're just stuck at the threads. what we want to happen is actually pop into the message that we're peeking. To do that, let's go back to our thread view controller extension, and in the commit view controller method, all we need to do is call navigation controller, push view controller, and then just use the parameter here, the commit view controller, or sorry, view controller to commit. And animated, we want true. Now this won't actually do a UI navigation controller animation. iOS is instead going to do its own custom transition where it springs and pops into the actual view controller. Let's run this again and take a look at exactly what I mean. So if I peek again on a thread and I pop into it, awesome. I get a nice little animation that looks like I'm actually pushing into this view. Now let's go back real quick. If I peek on this message thread, notice how there's a text view at the bottom of that peek. I mentioned earlier in the intro that there's no interaction on these UI view controllers that actually get peeked. So it's kind of wasted space. Just imagine if this message thread were actually taking up the entire interface. You could almost get a full message on that line. So wouldn't it be nice if we could get rid of that text input on the peek, but then still see it when we pop? Well, we can actually do that. In the view controller for location method, since this is the method that gets called right before we actually display the peek, before we return our message controller, we can set message controller load view if needed to get everything set up. And again on message controller, call set text input bar hidden to true, so it's hidden, and animated false, because we don't actually want to see the hide animation. Now this is just a custom API on Slack's open source text view and table view controller. It's really great. If you haven't looked into it before, it's pretty much the best thing out there for a messaging app. All right, running again. We peek, the thread's gone. Oh, but wait a minute. Now that we're actually popped into the thread, it'd be nice to have it, right? Well, let's fix that. Going back to our thread view controller extension, in the commit view controller method, just before we push, we can cast our view controller parameter. So if let message controller equals view controller to commit as optional messages view controller. So if we can succeed at that cast on our message controller, we can call set text input hidden false, animated false. Okay, let's take a look at that again. Now, if I peek, the text input's gone, and when I pop, it's there. Thanks, Greg. Now there's another type of message in our threads. If we go to the one with Matt Galloway and Ellen, we have these photos here. It would be really awesome if we could use our 3D Touch API for peek and pop to take a quick look at these photos without actually having to open the whole thing. Well, following a pretty similar steps as adding the peek and pop to the threads, we can add peek and pop to our images. So now let's open up Messages View Controller. Again, let's override ViewDidLoad, call super, and call register for previewing delegate self with view as our source view. Again, the compiler is pretty upset, so let's make it happy using, at the bottom, a Swift extension on messages view controller for the UI view controller previewing delegate. And let's add our two functions, previewing context view controller for location and previewing context commit view controller. All right, just as before, we need to take this CG point and turn it into some data we can actually use. And to get that data, we first need to get the index path where we're tapping. So for starters, let's first convert this point to a point in the coordinate space of our table view. So let's call let local location equal view convert point, and we're going to do the to view method here. So point location to view table view. All right, and just as before, let's add a guard. Let index path equal table view dot index path for row at point, and we'll use the local location here, comma, let cell equal table view dot cell for row at index path as optional image message cell, else return nil. Now, why are we adding this optional message cell casting here? Well, if I were to break down the UI of our app, we can see that there's actually two different cell types here. So this first cell type is a text message cell, and the next cell type is an image message cell. So what we can do is when 3D touch happens on anything in this view, we turn the point into an index path, and we check that that index path corresponds to an image message cell. That way, if 3D touches happen on a text cell, we just don't do anything. Next, we need to set our source rect. So let's first convert the coordinate space. So let frame equal cell.convert rect cell.message image view dot frame to view view. Now, why are we using the message image view frame? Well, going back to our exploded view here, a 3D touch may occur on anything in this cell. But when we do our blurring for the peak, we actually only want to not blur this image, and we want to blur everything else around it. So to do that, we take the frame of the image view, which is relative to the cell, and we convert that frame to be relative to the actual view controller's view. All right, let's actually set this frame. So using a previewing context dot source rect equals frame. Now we need to create a view controller. So let image controller equals storyboard dot new image view controller. And after we have our image view controller, let's actually set the data on it. Image controller dot image path equals thread dot messages, and using our index path again, index path dot row, and we'll actually just set the image path. And this is just going to set the image's file path so that the image view controller can load the file correctly. And we'll return image controller. Now, again, in order to actually get the pop effect, we need to push on our navigation controller. So in commit view controller, let's do navigation controller dot push view controller, and just pass in our view controller to commit parameter with animated as true.
So if we run this, we can go ahead and enter a message thread. Let's go ahead and peek on that thread and jump into it. And peek on one of our images and pops right into it. Notice again how if we go back to this screen and I just barely hold this peek and don't actually activate it yet, we can see how the source rect blurs everything outside of that image so that that transition looks perfect. All right, and that's it for demo 2. Next up is the lab. All right, and that's it for our session on 3D Touch. So let's take a quick second to look back at what all you learned. In the first demo, you learned about how to use quick actions with both static and dynamic actions to make navigating your app even easier. In the second demo, you learned about peek and pop so that you can conveniently take quick looks into your content and also navigate straight into them. And then in the lab, you learned about how to use custom gestures with UI Touch so that you can build your own 3D Touch gestures into your app. So, where do you go from here? Well, first off, we have an awesome blog post on our Instagram engineering blog that goes into a lot more detail about exactly how we implemented 3D Touch into Instagram. We cover more advanced topics like architecture and code composition. You can also find a really neat analysis and deep dive onto 3D Touch on krakendev.io/peek-pop. Apple has also published a human interface guidelines for 3D Touch, where they go into a lot of detail about when it's appropriate and sometimes when it's not appropriate to put functionality and features behind 3D Touch. And as always, you can find me on Twitter to ask me questions at any point in time.